So, hello, good afternoon, morning, or evening, depending on where you are right now, and welcome to a Creative Bureaucracy Festival discussion. It is my pleasure now to welcome Richard Reynolds. He's one of the pioneers of guerrilla gardening, and we are going to dig a bit deeper in that particular movement, its relationship with cities, and how are we seeing that movement after some years that you were just grinning in a do-it-yourself way, in a kind of punk way, our corners and streets.
Yes.
So
yeah. Thank you. No, great to be taking part.
Starting, I just wanna ask you this: after a few examples of guerrilla gardening in North America, like People's Park in Berkeley, late '60s, the movement really began to take off there and in Europe in the early 2000s. And you were, as I said, one of the pioneers in Europe, and you wrote that magnificent book on guerrilla gardening that was very, very important to many activists all around Europe and the world. And what I'm going to ask you, what was it like in those early days? And let's start with that.
Yes. Well, when I started guerrilla gardening in 2004 in central London, I was completely unaware of any history of this activity. It struck me as a straightforward, mischievous, fun, but also logical thing to do to fix a problem of neglected public space, but also to have the pleasure of doing it myself and to do it in my own way. It was just a hobby. I was blogging about it for my own amusement, to share with friends, and partly as a record in case I got in trouble. I could then very clearly show, look, here's before, here's after, I've got nothing to hide. So I'm an accidental activist. My motivations were fairly limited at that point, but I saw fairly quickly that people were interested, certainly friends and neighbours. They were intrigued, and I was surprised to be seen as a slightly heroic character, which obviously flattered the ego and motivated me to take on bigger challenges. And it was as I began writing more on the website that I became aware of the history. And it was the green guerrillas in New York in the early 1970s who were the most visible online back then. And their story had been told previously, and they'd evolved from doing work very much like I was doing, although actually on a much bigger scale, taking on vast areas of dilapidation in a very dilapidated inner city back then. But they'd evolved over 30 years to be a very legitimate, respectable, established network of community gardens. And whilst some were threatened and were lost to redevelopment in the early noughties, that had been their story. So that was very exciting for me, because I was happy to make the connection, and I got in touch with Donald, who'd been there back in the day and was very much a sort of spokesperson for those who'd been in the movement. And I began to piece together these activities from different places at different times. And I was asked by a publisher to write the book, and loved the challenge. And that encouraged me to dig even deeper. And I came across the stories of Gerard Winstanley in the 17th century, who's since been labelled as an agrarian, a communist, but he was essentially guerrilla gardening to grow food at a time of high food prices on public land. And of course, as you say, the Berkeley University activity in the 60s, Johnny Appleseed, one of the kind of folklore legends in the USA, planting apple trees in the 19th century. So there are a lot of these tales that are all connected by a very similar motivation, which is to make something of the land without owning it and without asking first, but just to use the opportunity. It's a similar approach, I should say. The motivations can vary a bit between radical transformation to society, or just a very pragmatic way of sorting out orphaned land, neglected, lost, confused spaces that don't get the care and love that they would do if they were more of a private garden, or more of a legitimate community space.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I was about to ask you about if you were influenced by the 17th century English diggers and so on. But it's quite interesting to say that probably you discovered them later on.
I discovered them later, but they did have an influence. I found Winstanley's story absolutely fascinating, mm-hmm. and I hope to some extent I learnt from his mistakes, mm-hmm. because whilst he's gone down in history as a significant character, he utterly failed in his objectives. Certainly in the short term, anyway, within his lifetime, his campaign sort of burnt out within about 2.5 or 3 years, because he terrified the authorities. And what they were actually doing in terms of gardening was pretty straightforward and not very threatening. And the officials that came to see what they were doing were not concerned and were happy to just let them get on with it. But he was a pamphlet writer, and it was his pamphlet writing that outlined objectives that terrified the authorities, and they came down very hard on him. So what I learned from that was, despite having labelled it guerrilla gardening and accidentally done so in the tradition of these New York guerrillas, I've tried to be pretty light and pop and fun and unthreatening, and happily taken part in all sorts of silly sorts of things to make it feel very mainstream and acceptable, and to let the politics be implicit rather than explicit. And that has got guerrilla gardening quite a long way, but I haven't always got my way. And sometimes the authorities do come down hard. They have their own vision of what they want a city to be like, and they win sometimes. Yeah, quite a lot of the time.
That's actually an element that it's showing up in different discussions around creative bureaucracy, that even though in most of the experience of those outside of bureaucracy that want to achieve goals that are traditionally public goals in terms of welfare, in terms of common spaces and so on, and having and with cases where in most of the cases the mood is playful and the intentions are good, but still there are some problems with authorities. So can you tell us some stories about those problems that showed up? What did it happen?
Yes. Well, so my problems with authorities sort of form into two groups. There's the misunderstandings, which actually are quite amusing. And those are occasions where police have seen us at work, or stopped me in the car on the way to do some gardening, and assumed that what we're doing is something far more deadly and serious, and have intervened. And in virtually all those cases, I've been allowed to just get on with it once they realised I wasn't stealing or doing terrorist activity. On one occasion, I was told to stop gardening. The police knew what we were doing. There was no misunderstanding, but we went back later and carried on, and that garden thrived for many years. But the other problem with authorities, and the one that really disappointed me, was that despite being very open, very clear in my approach and strategy, and happy to collaborate with authorities, and having received reasonable endorsements along the way, actually, as well, for the effort and achievement that had gone in, most notably from the Duchess of Cornwall, who wanted to come and see the gardening that we were doing, and I took her on a bus tour of Elephant and Castle, and we did some harvesting of lavender together on a traffic island that we'd planted up without any permission at all. So this was in 2011, and at that point I thought, well, I've kind of got a royal endorsement now. That should surely mean that this approach can be embraced by the authorities in a more in a larger scale way. But that just didn't happen in my part of London. When Transport for London, very much motivated by Mayor Boris Johnson at the time, was setting about re-landscaping a lot of the roads, essentially road widening in many cases at Elephant and Castle. An 8-lane inner ring road was created, and a lot of public space and green space destroyed in the mid 2010s. And I had hoped that the new landscape that was left would be a more collaborative process, particularly as Transport for London used images of my gardens to sell their vision to Londoners without my permission, which was fine. But I thought, this is a good sign, isn't it? Pictures of beautiful lavender fields adjacent to their roads and herbs and all sorts. But they were having none of it. It was a shocker. I even had several meetings with Witherford, Watson, Mann, who were the architects, very esteemed architects who were overseeing the landscaping of that, and they were friendlier, but they, in the end, I think, were as disheartened as I was, as what actually got built and planted was a travesty of what had been proposed. And they made it quite clear at meetings that I went along to, kind of invited myself to, really, that it was not possible. The only way gardening would be done would be with a significant contractor, and that even providing open soil was not an option for us to just go on and plant. They said they wanted vistas of stone, and they put concrete slabs down. So it was very, very disappointing, really big missed opportunity, so retrogressive compared with what I'd seen in so many parts of the world on my travels, where authorities have provided that canvas, or at least tolerated it. And yeah, Boris Johnson, I collared him about it in the street. He said, we just had to get something done. This was a few years before the Get Brexit Done slogan won him our last election. So I've seen what carnage he can do to my old neighbourhood in London, and I fled. But unfortunately, I haven't fled the country yet. I just fled Elephant and Castle to recharge and guerrilla garden in friendlier territory. Couldn't face the battle anymore.
Yeah, but now that you are building the bridge between your work and politics and policies, you have said once that my garden is in the middle of the road. And we are wondering if this idea connects to the commons movement that is increasingly coming into focus, and especially also if there is just something more than doing some just gardening, if there is a bigger political agenda, and if is that's political agenda what you are saying that you couldn't achieve.
Yes, well, there is, and I'm motivated by the feeling that public space is our space, and we have even more right to shape it if those who nominally are in charge of it are taking no interest. But on those occasions when they do, it's crucial that those who live near it, pass through it, use it, are really deeply consulted, and it just doesn't seem to happen. Even where I've moved to here, it's incredible the way our so-called democratic structure is set up, that bold decisions can be made with absolutely no consultation at all, and residents are considered, it seems, a pain if we have a strong opinion. It's very frustrating. It's very frustrating. And the beauty of using gardening as a way of getting the debate going is that it is disarming. You know, if you're debating road layouts and traffic and pollution, these things are it is easier for those in authority to dismiss the resident or the amateur as not being technical enough. But with gardening, it is an accessible and disarming pursuit, because the beauty of it, the transformation, the fact that it is a living thing, the fact that it's seasonal, it's ever changing. It is harder for authorities to have a role of superiority in that sphere. So I feel I've got a lot of success behind me, but I think when it clashes with ambitions that go far beyond that from authorities, it is very difficult. But it's as if gardening is the front line. Gardening can get the conversation going. Now that I've moved to back to Devon, where I came from originally, I immediately started guerrilla gardening, spotting locations that were very neglected. I knew the place pretty well, and although there are some respectable, great volunteer groups doing gardening in the town, there's plenty of rich pickings for the newbie in town to transform. And just like back in 2004, that activity has led to conversations with people that I wouldn't have had otherwise, because I'm out there, they can see me doing it, they see a transformation, they're curious. So I've met local politicians, I've met local activists, just because I'm out there participating in the space, not because I'm turning up at meetings, not because I'm tweeting at people, just through the activity itself. And I find that a great way of getting involved in my community and getting involved in other activity that starts with a conversation in the street.
This is really inspiring, Richard. We are actually branding this conversation under the umbrella small ideas, big impact. So some things that...
Well, that's it. That's exactly it.
And despite of being slightly maybe disappointed by the particular context of London, gardening has had a massive impact around cities across the globe. So what do you think about the impact of the idea? And if you can give some examples.
Yes. Well, the idea is definitely, it's contagious, and the period that I've been doing it in thankfully coincides with the web and social media. So sharing a transformation with others is very, very easy. And a lot of people guerrilla gardening do so as individuals. There are also groups, but for any individual, that connection you can make with a like-minded person on the other side of the world can be very supporting and motivating. So yes, it has become a contagious idea, and it's fascinating to see how it evolves in different places, and it takes on different characters. I mean, one of the very high-profile guerrilla gardeners is Ron Finley in Los Angeles, who now styles himself as a gangster gardener, sort of milking his origins and giving himself a sort of distinctive image. You've got historically some pirate gardeners in Germany. I remember gardening in Munich with some pixie gardeners who like to dress up as a way of bringing more fun to it and reassuring residents that they were not, they're not a threatening presence in their city. So it takes on many different characters in different places, and it waxes and wanes as well. It will go through periods in areas where there's a great deal of enthusiasm, and then people's lives change, they move on, they go on and do something else. But with the web, if they've shared a bit, it often it lives on somewhere on a YouTube channel, on a blog, for others to then discover later on and be inspired all over again.
Thank you so much. And just I was going to ask you a final question. So how do you see yourself now within that movement? How do you see your role nowadays?
So my role is to carry on tweeting about it. For those who are interested in what I'm doing, I still put out communication. I aspire to finding time to completely revamp my website and include more accessible content. I have an incredible archive of images I've taken around the world and films that I've never put online. And the website needs a big overhaul so that it's much more visual, and that content is there for anyone to discover and share. But I need to I don't know, that might happen for years. It's all in the hard drive. Yeah, I think I have stories to tell from what I've seen during a period of my life where I had the time and energy to gather a lot of great examples, and I'm gradually expanding my territory in Totnes, which is going really well. It's a fantastic climate down here as well. It's a bit wetter, which is very good for the guerrilla gardener. And who knows what other new opportunities might arise in the town. We're here for the foreseeable future. I'm also, I enjoy answering questions from people, students, media, writers. I happily chat about it. It's something I'm passionate about. And I keep my eye in on my old patches. I have friends who continue to live there and look after the great survivors of the road expansion. And I'm actually back in London next week, and we'll be checking in on what's going there. I still tend them from time to time when I'm in town.
We're very curious to know how do you see London, so we'll be checking your Twitter handle that probably is appearing in the description, so please follow Richard. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I hope everyone did as well. Let's keep in touch, and
thanks.
It's a great example of how a small idea got this big global impact, and how bureaucracy should be more creative reacting to that. Thank you very much, Richard.
Okay, thank you.